The road was so full of holes and quicksands, I durst not venture, a stranger then cannot easily escape the danger. Those are the words of an English traveler named Celia Fenns back in 1698. Quicksands in the road. Just think about that for a second. When we picture the 18th century, we usually imagine these elegant, polished carriages gliding effortlessly past beautiful estates, right? But the actual physical reality? It was muddy, it was bone-rattling, exhaustingly slow, and frankly, incredibly dangerous.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely shatter those romanticized illusions of early modern travel. We aren't looking at the past from the high-up perspective of kings declaring wars. Instead, we're going to dig into the physical, financial, and psychological toll of simply trying to move from point A to point B. By reconstructing the actual, everyday human experience of the road, we're going to see exactly how geography, wealth, and power dictated who got to move and who had to stay put.
Before we even pack our bags, so to speak, we have to wrap our heads around this one foundational number, 5 to 10 miles. For the vast majority of ordinary people living in the 17th and 18th centuries, this was the absolute edge of their known universe. This was roughly the distance from a rural farming hamlet to the local market town. They might walk that distance and back in a single day, maybe a few times a year, and that was it. Most people simply never roamed any further from home than that. Mobility wasn't normal. It was a very rare exception.
Okay, part 1, the mud and the mire.
To really understand this profound immobility, we have to look at the physical landscape of the era. Before the 1700s, major roads across Europe were routinely documented as completely impassable. We're talking about simple dirt or gravel paths, deeply rutted by carts, that would literally turn into quagmires of quicksand the moment it rained. And maintenance? Well, that was entirely a local problem. Wealthier parishes might toss down some gravel, but poor, rural regions just didn't have the cash. The result was this wildly fragmented network where a heavy rainstorm didn't just delay your trip, it effectively trapped entire populations in their villages.
Moving on to part 2, the price of paved roads. As centralized states started growing in the 1700s, there was this intense, desperate push to modernize these impassable tracks. Historians call this the transportation revolution. But how societies actually paid for this revolution varied wildly. Take a look at this map. To fix their potholes, Britain relied on a localized toll-based system. Local communities were legally allowed to set up toll gates, turnpikes, and literally charge travelers for using the road. The money went directly into maintaining that specific stretch of dirt. It was essentially user-funded infrastructure, and as you can see, it was wildly successful, spreading like wildfire across the country.
And the direct payoff of this user-funded system was a massive spike in passenger speed between 1750 and 1830. Because the roads were finally being paved and kept clear, stagecoach speeds actually doubled. Which sounds absolutely incredible until you look closely and realize that this highly celebrated world-changing doubling of speed topped out at a blistering 8 miles per hour.
Now, right across the English Channel, the French state took a radically different and honestly far darker approach. To build their magnificently straight, beautiful highways, France instituted the corvée in 1738. This was a brutal system of extorted, forced peasant labor. So rather than charging wealthy travelers a toll to use the road, the government just forced impoverished rural farmers to build the roads for free. So you have this fundamental civilizational difference in how infrastructure is built. The British Turnpike was a user-pay system that locals generally accepted. The French corvée, though, it was ripping starving peasants out of their own fields right during crucial planting and harvesting seasons. It caused widespread agricultural disruption, extreme poverty, and this intense, burning resentment in the countryside. The system was so deeply oppressive that when the French Empire tried to force it onto their colonists in New France, what is now Canada, it actually sparked whispers of organized mutiny.
Part 3. Canals and mountain passes.
Of course, dirt roads weren't the only way to get around. If you wanted to escape the bone-rattling carriages, you had to look for alternative infrastructures. In the Netherlands, they used brilliant hydraulic engineering to turn canals into their primary highways. They used something called the trekschout, which was a horse-drawn towboat, and it was amazing. It was incredibly reliable, wonderfully smooth, and operated on a strictly synchronized schedule. Instead of bouncing over potholes and praying it didn't rain, a Dutch traveler could just glide peacefully along the water. It was the absolute gold standard of early modern comfort.
But what if you had to cross the Alps? Water wasn't going to help you there. You had to use alpine chair porters, and this was just a terrifying sensory overload of an experience. You sat in a wooden chair fixed between two long poles, hoisted up by local porters using shoulder straps. And these guys didn't just casually walk. They ran down steep, winding, icy stone paths. To navigate the sharp corners, they would literally swing the chairs with the terrified passengers inside out over precipitous, sheer, rocky drop-offs. So while 18th century poets were safely at home writing about the romantic, sublime beauty of the mountains, the physical reality of actually crossing them was sheer, unadulterated terror.
All right, part 4, the cost of mobility. Let's talk money. Because once the infrastructure was actually there, taking a journey meant slamming into some severe financial brick walls. Astronomical costs priced ordinary people completely out of the travel game. Just keeping a single riding horse in London could run you £120 a year, which was more than the cost of a full-time servant. A decent family coach, an eye-watering £400. This financial reality forced even mildly affluent, respectable families, like the famous author Jane Austen and her sister, to rely on the absolute most economical alternative, a donkey pulling a tiny cart.
And the costs weren't just financial. There was a massive social tax as well, deeply structured by gender. Strict societal rules dictated that women simply could not travel alone without facing intense suspicion and absolute social ruin. Think about the logistics of that. Wealthy families couldn't just have a female relative hop on a horse to visit an aunt. They had to organize these massive, heavily chaperoned caravans, moving practically their entire household at once just to ensure her respectable, safe passage.
But what if you couldn't afford a private coach? Public transit offered its very own unique forms of misery. The famous French diligence was relatively fast, covering maybe 100 miles a day, but it was frantic. You were jammed in a box with 8 sweating strangers, and they dragged you out of bed at 2 in the morning to start the day's travel. But hey, that still beat the German Postwagen. That was little more than an open wooden cart. It crawled along at 3 miles an hour, completely exposed to the rain and the snow, just jogging on day and night without stopping. Just an agonizing, weather-beaten crawl.
And what amazing reward awaited you at the end of a long, exhausting day of travel? Continental inns. The Scottish author Tobias Smollett complained bitterly that the inns in France were smoky, drafty, and utterly devoid of cleanliness. He famously wrote that they were utter strangers to what we call common decency, would make even a native of Edinburgh stop his nose. The floors were filthy, the windows never shut tight, and you were entirely at the mercy of whatever meager, completely unappetizing food the local innkeeper had scraped together that day.
Finally, part 5. The perils of the journey. See, bad roads and dirty beds are uncomfortable, for sure. But as you moved further away from the safety of the town walls, travel became genuinely, literally lethal. I want you to put yourself in this scenario. You're sitting in a wooden carriage, bumping along at just 5 miles an hour, and the sun is beginning to set. And then, the road enters the woods. What happens next? In the 18th century, that wasn't just a metaphor for getting lost. It was a trigger for deep, visceral psychological anxiety.
Because the wilderness outside the city limits was governed by highwaymen and roving bands of desperate brigands. And these heavily armed criminals didn't just target wealthy stagecoaches, they were an absolute terror to remote peasants. A localized fire set by a few brigands could instantly reduce an entire farming family to permanent starvation. The utter helplessness that everyday people felt against these roving threats fostered a really deep, lingering resentment against the monarchs. After all, the king took their taxes, but entirely failed to protect them on the roads.
Deciding to go on a journey was essentially treated as a heavily armed military operation. Just look at this perfectly calm advice from an anonymous 18th century travel guide. It tells tourists that double-barreled pistols are very well calculated for the defense of the traveler. You weren't packing a neck pillow and some snacks for a trip to Amsterdam. You were packing a brace of loaded firearms, and you kept them right in your lap.
Getting from Paris to Amsterdam alive in 1760 meant strictly adhering to some pretty grim survival strategies. You had to stay on heavily trafficked routes. You never ever traveled at night. You avoided forests like the plague. And you always carried reliable personal protection. The road was simply a theater of absolute vulnerability.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to ponder today. We so often look at the past, and we wonder why everyday peasants and villagers just stayed in their small hamlets their entire lives. We look back and we view them as trapped, uneducated, unadventurous. But when you realize that venturing onto the 18th century road meant facing extortionate financial costs, bone-breaking mud, massive social anxiety, and the literal, deadly threat of armed highwaymen in the dark, how does that change our understanding of staying home? Perhaps the local village wasn't a prison at all. Perhaps, in a world defined by the brutal realities of the road, staying put was actually the ultimate survival strategy. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the past.